The operations room at Army Group Center headquarters fell into the kind of silence that follows catastrophic news, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the unspoken recognition that something fundamental had broken in the German military machine. It was early July 1944, and the reports arriving from the front told a story that veteran staff officers found almost impossible to process. Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive, had not merely defeated German forces in Belarus, but had systematically destroyed them, encircling and annihilating entire divisions, shattering corps, and eliminating army-level formations with a speed and thoroughness that exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had experienced, even during the catastrophic winter of 1941–42. General Hans Jordan, Chief of Staff of Fourth Army, stood before the situation map, watching the symbols representing German divisions being crossed out one by one, each mark signifying not a tactical setback, but the complete destruction of a unit that could never be rebuilt, that represented years of training and combat experience, now lost in a matter of days. The units being destroyed were not rear-echelon formations or hastily assembled militia, but some of the best divisions remaining in the German order of battle. The 78th Sturm Division, veterans of years of Eastern Front combat, had been encircled near Vitebsk and destroyed. The 6th Luftwaffe Field Division had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The 31st Infantry Division, the 206th Infantry Division, the 246th Infantry Division, all veteran formations with established combat records, had been surrounded and eliminated in the opening phase of the Soviet offensive. These were units that had held defensive lines against previous Soviet attacks, that had conducted fighting withdrawals with professional competence, that represented the kind of experienced, cohesive formations that modern armies could not quickly replace. What made the losses particularly devastating was not just their scale, but their concentration. Operation Bagration had struck Army Group Center, which had been considered a relatively quiet sector of the Eastern Front, where veteran divisions could rest and rebuild after the grinding battles farther south. The German High Command had expected Soviet summer offensives to focus on Ukraine or the Baltic region, where previous operations had suggested Soviet strategic priorities lay. Instead, Stalin and his marshals had chosen to attack precisely where German defenses were thinnest, where the terrain, forests and marshes that German planners thought would hinder offensive operations, had actually channeled German forces into positions where they could be systematically encircled. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commanding Army Group Center, had sent increasingly desperate reports to OKW in the offensive's first days, describing Soviet attacks of an intensity and coordination that exceeded anything previously experienced. The artillery preparations preceding Soviet assaults involved thousands of guns firing concentrations that pulverized German defensive positions. The armor breakthroughs exploited gaps with a speed that prevented German reserves from establishing new defensive lines. The encirclements were executed with operational sophistication that demonstrated the Red Army had learned mobile warfare and was now executing it with professional competence that rivaled or exceeded German capabilities. But most troubling were the reports about what happened to German units once they were encircled. In previous battles, surrounded German formations had often fought their way out or had held positions until relieved, maintaining organizational coherence even in desperate circumstances. At Bagration, encircled units were being systematically destroyed with a thoroughness that suggested Soviet tactics had evolved specifically to prevent breakouts or prolonged resistance. Soviet forces would surround a position, then compress the pocket, while maintaining external blocking positions to prevent relief. Artillery and air power would pound the trapped forces while supplies and ammunition were exhausted. When German units attempted breakouts, they found themselves facing prepared Soviet positions in multiple directions, with every escape route anticipated and covered. General Kurt von Tippelskirch, who replaced Busch as Army Group Center Commander after the initial catastrophe, arrived at his new headquarters to find the situation even worse than reports had suggested. Entire corps had effectively ceased to exist. The 53rd Corps, the 12th Corps, the 27th Corps, formations that on paper commanded multiple divisions, had been reduced to scattered groups of survivors trying to reach German lines. The divisions themselves, even when not completely destroyed, had lost their heavy equipment, their artillery, their cohesion as fighting units. A division that survived encirclement might emerge with a few thousand men who had escaped on foot, having abandoned all tanks, vehicles, and support weapons, no longer capable of conducting operations at anything approaching divisional scale. The reports arriving at OKW documented losses with bureaucratic precision that made the catastrophe no less shocking. 28 German divisions destroyed or rendered combat ineffective in 3 weeks. Approximately 300,000 German soldiers killed, captured, or missing. Over 2,000 tanks and assault guns lost. Artillery pieces by the thousands abandoned or destroyed. The scale exceeded Stalingrad, exceeded the disasters in Ukraine, exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had experienced in its history. This was not merely defeat, but the annihilation of an entire army group's combat power. General Heinz Guderian, now Chief of the General Staff, attempted to explain the catastrophe to Hitler in terms that might penetrate the Führer's denial, while avoiding the rage that admitting German weakness typically triggered. Guderian focused on the tactical factors. Soviet numerical superiority in the attacked sectors had been overwhelming, perhaps 5-1 in infantry and even higher in armor and artillery. Soviet operational planning had been sophisticated, achieving surprise regarding timing and location, despite German intelligence suspecting summer offensives were coming. The terrain favored Soviet operations in ways German planners had not anticipated. But Guderian knew, and every professional officer studying the reports knew, that tactical factors alone did not explain Bagration's catastrophic results. The Red Army of 1944 was fundamentally different from the force that had been shattered in 1941. It had learned operational warfare, had developed doctrines for breakthrough and exploitation that were being executed with professional competence, possessed commanders like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Chernyakhovsky, who understood modern mechanized warfare and had the resources to implement their concepts effectively. Most fundamentally, the Red Army now possessed overwhelming material superiority, more tanks, more artillery, more aircraft, better logistics, while German forces were increasingly short of everything except the tactical skill that could no longer compensate for systematic disadvantages. The destruction of veteran units meant more than just losses in immediate combat power. The Wehrmacht's effectiveness had always depended on experienced soldiers and junior leaders who understood combined arms tactics, who could exercise initiative when plans failed, who provided the institutional knowledge that made units effective in combat. A veteran infantry division with years of combat experience could accomplish missions that newly raised divisions could not, could adapt to unexpected situations, could maintain cohesion under pressure that would break inexperienced units. These veteran formations took years to create. Soldiers had to be trained, had to experience combat, had to learn the 1,000 small lessons that separated effective troops from enthusiastic amateurs. Junior officers and NCOs had to develop leadership skills through experience that could not be taught in schools. Units had to fight together, had to develop the trust and understanding that made them effective as cohesive organizations rather than collections of individuals. The divisions being destroyed at Bagration represented years of accumulated experience, organizational culture, and combat effectiveness that could not be recreated even if Germany had unlimited time and resources, which it manifestly did not. The replacement system that was supposed to rebuild destroyed divisions was completely inadequate to the scale of losses Bagration inflicted. Germany could conscript more men, could form new divisions on paper, could assign them numbers and designations that suggested combat capability, but the replacements were increasingly old men, boys, previously exempted workers, men with medical conditions that had kept them from service earlier. The training they received was abbreviated, focused on basic skills rather than the sophisticated combined arms tactics that veteran units had mastered. The equipment they received was whatever could be scraped together from declining production and dwindling stocks. Most critically, the experienced personnel who normally train and lead these formations were precisely the soldiers being lost at Bagration and in the simultaneous disasters unfolding in Normandy following the Allied invasion.
The NCOs and junior officers who understood how to lead men in combat, who could train replacements, who formed the backbone of effective military units, were dying in the pockets around Vitebsk and Minsk. Their loss meant that even if Germany could field new divisions, those divisions would be led by men with minimal experience, trying to train soldiers with even less, creating formations that were divisions in name only, incapable of the tactical competence that had characterized Wehrmacht operations. Field Marshal Walter Model, who had earned a reputation as a specialist in defensive operations and crisis management, was dispatched to take command of Army Group Center and stabilize the collapsing front. Model's assessment, delivered to Hitler with the bluntness that Model's tactical successes allowed him, was that Army Group Center as an effective fighting force had ceased to exist. Individual units were still fighting. Some survivors were making their way back to German lines, but the organizational structure that allowed corps and armies to conduct coordinated operations had been shattered. Rebuilding would require months under ideal circumstances, circumstances that included Soviet forces halting their offensive to allow Germany time to recover, which they showed no intention of doing. Model's immediate priority was preventing complete catastrophe, establishing some kind of defensive line using whatever forces remained, preventing Soviet exploitation from reaching the Baltic states or driving into Poland. This required accepting that the destroyed divisions could not be rebuilt in place, that the line would have to be held with whatever units could be moved from other sectors, and that these movements would create vulnerabilities elsewhere that Soviet forces might exploit. The strategic implications of Bagration's destruction of Germany's best units extended far beyond the immediate Eastern Front situation. The Normandy front was consuming divisions at an unsustainable rate, with Allied air superiority and material advantages creating a Western catastrophe that paralleled the Eastern disaster. German forces in Italy were locked in defensive battles that tied down divisions desperately needed elsewhere. The need to garrison occupied territories across Europe, to defend against partisan warfare, to maintain forces in Scandinavia against potential Allied invasions, all of these commitments remained even as the combat forces that might fulfill them were being systematically destroyed. The arithmetic was brutal and inescapable. Germany was losing veteran divisions faster than they could be replaced, even with inadequately trained formations, while simultaneously facing enemies on multiple fronts who possessed material superiority that grew more overwhelming with each passing month. The destruction of Army Group Center's best units at Bagration represented not just one defeat, but a symptom of strategic bankruptcy. Germany could no longer sustain the multi-front war it was fighting, could not protect the territories it occupied, could not prevent the steady compression of its defensive perimeter. General Adolf Husinger, chief of operations at OKH, compiled assessments that attempted to project future force requirements based on current loss rates and replacement capabilities. The projections showed that at the current rate of attrition, Germany would run out of trained soldiers capable of conducting effective operations within months, not years. The veteran units being destroyed were being replaced by formations that existed primarily on paper, that lacked the training, equipment, and leadership to function as effective combat forces, that would be swept aside by Allied offensives with even less resistance than the units they replaced. Hitler's response to reports about Bagration revealed the complete disconnect between military reality and his understanding of the strategic situation. He blamed commanders for not holding positions, blamed soldiers for not fighting with sufficient determination, blamed the loss of veteran units on the weakness of individual generals rather than acknowledging the systematic failures that had created conditions where such catastrophe was possible. When Model explained that destroyed divisions could not be immediately rebuilt, Hitler ordered the formation of new divisions using the same designations, as though symbolic continuity could substitute for actual combat capability. The psychological impact on surviving officers and soldiers who witnessed the destruction of their units was profound and demoralizing. Men who had fought through years of Eastern Front combat, who had survived the winter of 1941–42 and the battles of 1943, who considered themselves members of elite veteran formations, watched those formations literally disappear in weeks of fighting. Soldiers who escaped encirclement described seeing their regiments destroyed, their comrades killed or captured in masses, the organizational structures they had known for years simply ceasing to exist. This demoralization spread through the German forces in ways that went beyond simple fear of death or defeat. Veteran soldiers understood that they were fighting in a lost cause, that the destruction of experienced units meant replacements would be increasingly inadequate, that the tactical excellence that had sustained German forces despite strategic disadvantages was eroding with the loss of the men who possessed that excellence. The pride in unit identity, in being part of established combat records, dissolved when those formations were destroyed and replaced with paper organizations bearing the same numbers but possessing none of the capability. The Soviet forces executing Operation Bagration demonstrated capabilities that forced German commanders to fundamentally reassess their understanding of the Red Army. The coordination between armor, infantry, artillery, and air power showed sophisticated planning and execution. The operational tempo of Soviet advances indicated logistical capabilities that could sustain rapid movement across vast distances. The systematic approach to destroying encircled forces revealed tactical doctrine specifically developed to eliminate German units rather than simply bypassing them.
Most troubling was the evidence that Soviet commanders were now outthinking their German counterparts at the operational level. The deception operations that had convinced German intelligence the summer offensive would strike elsewhere showed Soviet mastery of operational security. The choice of Army Group Center as the target demonstrated strategic sophistication, attacking where German forces were weakest rather than where they were strongest. The execution of multiple simultaneous encirclements showed the kind of operational art that Germans had prided themselves on possessing exclusively. The destruction of Germany's best units at Bagration marked a threshold in the war's Eastern Front campaign. Before Bagration, German forces could tell themselves they were conducting skillful defensive operations against numerically superior enemies, that tactical excellence compensated for strategic disadvantages, that veteran units could hold positions despite difficult circumstances. After Bagration, these comforting narratives became unsustainable. The best units had been destroyed. The tactical excellence that survived was insufficient to prevent catastrophic defeats, and the strategic situation was obviously hopeless to anyone willing to see clearly. For younger officers and enlisted men who had joined the Wehrmacht later in the war, Bagration provided education in realities that propaganda had obscured. They learned that German tactical superiority was myth rather than fact, that Soviet forces could execute operations with professional competence, that the racial theories about Slavic inferiority were lies that bore no relation to the actual capabilities of enemies who were systematically destroying the Wehrmacht. These lessons came at terrible cost. Many who learned them died in the pockets around Vitebsk and Minsk. But those who survived carried the knowledge that changed how they understood the war and Germany's prospects. The Allied intelligence services monitoring German radio traffic and interrogating prisoners from destroyed units recognized that something fundamental had changed in the Wehrmacht's condition. The destruction of veteran formations, the replacement with inadequate units, the declining quality of German resistance all pointed toward an enemy whose military capability was eroding faster than battlefield defeats alone explained. This intelligence informed Allied planning for subsequent operations, suggesting that German forces might collapse more quickly than conservative estimates projected, that offensive operations might achieve breakthrough and exploitation that had been difficult earlier in the war. By August 1944, as Soviet forces liberated Minsk and drove toward Poland, while in the West Allied forces broke out from Normandy, the strategic picture for Germany was unmistakably catastrophic. The best units were gone, destroyed in battles that had achieved nothing except buying time measured in weeks. The replacements were inadequate to fill the gaps. The enemies were advancing from multiple directions with overwhelming force. The defensive perimeter was contracting toward Germany itself. The generals who learned their best units were destroyed at Bagration understood they were witnessing not just military defeat, but the Wehrmacht's effective destruction as a professional fighting force. What remained could fight individual battles, could delay Allied advances, could demonstrate the tactical competence that veteran soldiers retained. But the organizational capacity to conduct sustained operations, to implement strategic plans, to function as coherent armies rather than collections of desperate units fighting isolated battles, this had been shattered in the forests of Belarus, along with the divisions that had possessed it. General Jordan, still serving on Army Group Center's staff, compiled the final accounting of the destroyed divisions weeks after the offensive's conclusion. The list read like a memorial to the Wehrmacht's combat effectiveness. Divisions that had fought in Poland and France, that had advanced to the gates of Moscow, that had held defensive lines through years of Soviet offensives, now reduced to casualty statistics and loss reports. Some would be nominally reconstituted, given the same numbers, and sent back to the front, but they would bear no resemblance to the veteran formations they replaced, except in designation. The destruction was not merely organizational, but human. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, many of them veterans with years of combat experience, were dead or in Soviet prisoner of war camps where few would survive. The institutional knowledge they represented, the tactical skills they had developed, the leadership they provided, all of this was lost permanently, could not be recreated or replaced. The Wehrmacht that emerged from Bagration was fundamentally different from the force that had entered the battle, less capable, less experienced, less able to resist the enemies closing in from all directions. When German generals learned their best units were destroyed, they learned that the war was lost, not just strategically, but practically, that Germany no longer possessed the military force necessary to defend itself. The fighting would continue, but the outcome was determined. Some drew the appropriate conclusions and began thinking about how to end the war before complete catastrophe. Others continued fighting from professional duty, from fear of the consequences of surrender, from inability to imagine alternatives to continued resistance. But all understood that something irreplaceable had been lost in the forests and pockets of Belarus, that the destruction of the best units meant the destruction of Germany's ability to wage war effectively. And the reports arriving from the front documented not just defeat, but the Wehrmacht's effective death as the military instrument that had conquered most of Europe just 4 years earlier.